The night my mother passed, it wasn't just her death that haunted us. It was the curse she left behind. You see, when someone like my mother speaks her final words, they carry weight. And my mother? Her last command wasn't a wish or a prayer, it was an order. An order that would haunt my father and me for the rest of our lives. She wasn't a woman you could ignore. She controlled everything, and even death couldn't take that away. Her eyes were the last thing I saw as she lay there, and in her silent gaze, I felt the promise of something dark. Her life is mine to control, even beyond the grave, she had told my father, and he, always the obedient one, promised to carry out her wishes. But what did that mean for me? What was I to do when the woman who had tormented me for years gave him one final command? What happened next? How my father and I became trapped in a world of fear and silence was the beginning of a journey I never expected. A journey that would take us from the darkest corners of fear to the moment of our escape and beyond. But it wasn't an easy journey. It took everything I had to survive and to finally break free from her grasp. And it was my father, of all people, who saved me. You wouldn't believe the man he became when he was forced to choose between saving me and keeping his peace. Stay with me, my dears, because this is a story of survival, of resilience, and of a love so deep that even death couldn't destroy it. It's the story of how a daughter and a father finally fought back, and how they found freedom when they thought it was too late. Hello, my dear friends. My name is Josephine, and this is my story. But it's not just my story. It's the story of survival, of love, and of finding freedom where you thought it was impossible. I grew up in a small house tucked away in the woods. It was simple, but there was always something dark about it, something that gnawed at the edges of our everyday life. My mother, Marilyn, was a teacher, and my father, Walter, was a quiet man who worked hard at the lumber mill. From the outside, our life looked ordinary. But inside it was anything but. You see, my mother didn't believe in ordinary. She believed in control. She controlled everything. The way we ate, the way we spoke, the way we breathed. If I walked too loudly, she'd snap at me. If I spoke too softly, she'd scold me. And God help me if I made a mistake, no matter how small. Her punishments were never physical, but they were worse. They were mental, emotional. She broke me down piece by piece until I didn't even recognize myself anymore. But my father? He was different. My father was strong, but not in the way most people think. He was the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without saying a word. And I adored him, but as much as I wanted him to protect me, I didn't understand why he didn't stand up to her, why he let her have all the power. All I wanted was for him to fight back, to defend me. But the truth was he couldn't. My mother's grip on him was just as tight as it was on me. His eyes would fill with sorrow every time I made a mistake, but he never said anything. He was afraid. Afraid of her wrath, afraid of what would happen if he finally broke free from her rules. And so he stayed silent, and I learned to stay silent too. There were moments, though, moments when I saw a flicker of the man he could have been. In the quiet of the night, when my mother's anger was far away, he'd tell me stories of when he was young, about his dreams, about the adventures he once wanted to have. Those were the moments when I saw the spark in his eyes, the spark that was slowly being extinguished by the years of fear and submission. But for me, the real escape didn't come from leaving our home. No, the escape came from within. From realizing that I was more than just my mother's puppet, more than just the girl who could never get it right. I had to find my own voice, and that's where my story begins. At the moment when I decided I wasn't going to let fear define me anymore. But that didn't happen overnight. It wasn't until much later, until the day my mother gave her final command, that I understood what I had to do to truly escape. And that, my dears, is when everything changed. My mother, Marilyn, was a woman of power. Not the kind of power you see on television or read about in books, but the quiet, insidious power that seeps into your soul and takes root deep inside. Her strength wasn't in her words. It was in her ability to make you believe that she controlled your every move. That without her, you were nothing. At first, when I was a child, I thought it was normal. It was just the way things were. I remember waking up every morning to the sound of the rooster crowing before dawn. I'd stumble out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and head straight to the kitchen. Breakfast was never a joy. There was no laughter at our table, no friendly conversation like the other kids talked about. It was always quiet. My mother would sit at the head of the table, watching me as I prepared the meal. Everything had to be perfect. The eggs had to be scrambled to her liking, fluffy, but not too soft. The bread toasted just right. If I made a mistake, if I dropped a piece of silverware, her cold, steely eyes would lock on me, and I would feel the heat of her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She was never satisfied, never content. If I spoke too loudly, she'd snap, "Don't raise your voice, girl. Learn to speak like a lady." If I spoke too softly, she'd scold me. "You're not a mouse, Josie. Stop hiding behind that tiny voice of yours. Speak up or no one will hear you." It didn't matter what I did. I was always wrong in her eyes. But it wasn't just in the little things. No, it was in the way she controlled everything. From the clothes I wore to the way I held my fork. Even my emotions were dictated by her moods. I remember one day, sitting quietly in the living room reading a book. My mother walked in, looked at me and asked, "Why are you sitting there like a lazy thing? Go outside and get some fresh air before you turn into a vegetable." I didn't dare question her. I got up and went outside, even though I didn't want to. But that's what you did when you lived with her. There was no room for questions, no room for your own will. At school, it was even worse. I wasn't just the teacher's daughter. I was the object of her constant scrutiny. If I made a mistake on a test, my mother would punish me when I got home. She'd make me stand in front of the mirror for hours, staring at my reflection as she lectured me about the importance of perfection. I wasn't allowed to have a bad day. I wasn't allowed to be human. The other children at school, they were scared of her. They didn't want to be near me. No one dared to challenge her. She ruled the classroom with an iron fist, and anyone who spoke out of line, anyone who didn't follow her strict rules, would be made an example of. I learned to stay in the background, to never attract attention, to blend in with the walls and hope that no one noticed me. And my father? He was a ghost in our house, a shadow. He was a kind man, one who would do anything to keep the peace, but he was utterly incapable of standing up to my mother. I remember one night, sitting at the dinner table watching him as he ate his food in silence. My mother would say something harsh, and instead of defending me, instead of saying something to calm the storm, he would lower his eyes and nod, as though it were the only option he had. I used to ask him why he didn't speak up, why he let her treat us like this. He would sigh deeply, a look of sorrow in his eyes, and say, "Your mother doesn't know how to love, Josie. She only knows how to control." But those words never made sense to me. How could a mother, how could someone who claimed to love you, treat you like this? How could someone who was supposed to protect you, help you, make you feel safe, only make you feel small and worthless? As I got older, the control grew more subtle, more dangerous. My mother wasn't content with just ruling the house. She wanted to rule my life. When I turned 16, she tried to force me into a marriage with a man I barely knew. "It's time for you to grow up, Josie. You need to start acting like a woman," she said, as if the life I had lived until then hadn't been real. As if I wasn't already living under her thumb, doing everything she told me. She told my father that it was what was best for me, that I didn't need to go to college, that I didn't need to have dreams or a future of my own. I was supposed to be her little girl forever, someone who would live in the shadow of her commands. But in the silence of my room, late at night, I would dream. I would imagine a life where I wasn't afraid to speak, where I wasn't terrified of making a mistake, where I could be free. But I knew those dreams were just that, dreams. I didn't know how to break free. I didn't know how to escape her. It wasn't until much later, when my mother's grip finally started to weaken, when her health began to fail, that I understood something. I realized that her control had nothing to do with love. It had nothing to do with caring for me or my father. It was about fear. She used fear to control us, and in doing so, she created a prison, a life where we lived for her, but never for ourselves. As she grew sicker, she became even more demanding, her cruelty sharpened by her illness. The more her body failed her, the more she took from us. It was as if she knew her time was running out, and she wanted to make sure we were bound to her even after death. But that's the thing about fear. It only holds you down if you let it. And there came a moment, a single moment, when I realized that the only way to survive was to stop being afraid. If you ever met my father, Walter, you would see a quiet man, with gentle hands and a kind smile. He was never loud, never demanding. His strength wasn't in his words. It was in his silence. People respected him, not because he sought respect, but because he gave it freely. He was the kind of man who quietly took on the weight of the world, never complaining, never seeking a spotlight. Growing up, I always thought my father was a rock, a steady, unshakable figure who would always be there to protect me. But as I got older, I began to understand the truth that my father, as strong as he seemed, was broken in ways I couldn't comprehend at the time. I watched him, day after day, as he lived under my mother's rule. And I wondered, why didn't he stand up for me? Why didn't he fight back when she lashed out? As a little girl, I assumed it was because he didn't love me enough, that maybe I wasn't worth defending. But in time, I came to realize that my father didn't lack courage. He lacked the freedom to act. My father, like many men of his time, had been trained to think that his role was to provide and protect. He worked hard at the lumber mill every day, his hands calloused from years of labor. He was quiet, strong in his own way, but he never questioned my mother. He never questioned the rules she set for our lives, and I hated him for it. I hated him because I wanted him to fight for us. I wanted him to raise his voice, to stand tall and tell my mother she was wrong. But instead he just nodded and took it. I remember one winter night, I overheard a conversation between him and my mother in the kitchen. She was shouting about some small mistake I had made, something trivial, like forgetting to sweep the floor properly. My mother's voice was harsh, and I could hear the control in every word. And then I heard my father's response. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even an attempt to make peace. It was a quiet admission of defeat. "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if he were the one who had failed, not me. That was the moment when I understood. My father wasn't weak. He was terrified. Terrified of my mother's wrath. Terrified of the consequences that would follow if he ever dared to defy her. He had lived in the shadows of her power for so long that he had lost the ability to fight back, even for me. But that didn't mean he didn't care. That didn't mean he didn't love me. I remember the times when my father would sit with me on the porch, just the two of us, away from my mother's watchful eyes. The stillness of those moments was the only peace I knew. We would watch the birds flying across the sky, or listen to the rustle of the pine trees in the wind. Sometimes he would talk about the world beyond our home, about his childhood, about the dreams he had once had. He talked about the places he wanted to visit, the adventures he wished he could have. He would tell me stories of when he was young, how he had once dreamed of becoming a carpenter, traveling the country building homes for people. But I could see it in his eyes. Those dreams had died long ago. They had been buried beneath the weight of my mother's control, suffocated by the demands of a life he never chose. And I could see the regret in his eyes, the regret of a man who had given up his own happiness for the sake of keeping the peace. He loved me. I knew that. But he didn't know how to fight for me. And that broke me in ways I couldn't put into words, because I needed him to fight. I needed him to protect me from her. There were moments, though, when I saw a flicker of the man he could have been. It would come out in small acts, like when he would slip me a piece of candy when my mother wasn't looking, or when he would hug me tightly before I went to bed, whispering softly, "Everything will be okay." Those moments were rare, but they meant the world to me. They were the only times I felt safe. And then, when I turned 16, everything began to change. My mother's illness started to take a toll on her, and the house became even darker. But it was in those dark moments, when I saw my father's fear most clearly, that something in me snapped. I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep waiting for my father to be the hero I needed. I had to be the hero of my own story. And that, my dears, is when I began to understand my father in a way I never had before. I began to see him not just as my father, but as a man who had lived in the shadows for far too long. There comes a moment in every person's life when they reach their breaking point. For my father, it was the day my mother threatened to take me away, to force me into a life I couldn't bear. And for the first time in his life, he said, "No, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand speech. There was no fiery confrontation. It was simply a quiet but firm refusal, the kind of refusal that comes from the soul, a refusal that finally broke the shackles of years of fear." My mother's health had been failing for some time. Her body had become frail, almost skeletal, as if the illness was eating her from the inside out. But even in her weakening state, her power hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified. I could see it in the way she looked at my father. She had become more unpredictable, more volatile, as if she knew the end was near and wanted to make sure her control would remain even after she was gone. One evening, while the rest of the house was quiet, my mother called me into her room. Her voice, raspy and weak, echoed through the hallway as I reluctantly approached her door. I had learned long ago that when she called, you came. You didn't question it. You didn't hesitate. So, I walked in, heart pounding, bracing myself for whatever cruel command she had for me that day. "Sit down," she rasped, her eyes burning with the same cold intensity they always had. "I've made arrangements for you." I froze, confused. "Arrangements?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes," she said, a faint, sick smile curling on her lips. "You're going to marry Dennis. Dennis, my uncle. The man who had always made me feel uncomfortable with his lingering gaze. The man who had always seemed to hover in the background of our lives. He was my mother's brother, and I had always feared him. But my fear of him was nothing compared to the terror I felt at the thought of being trapped with him forever. "No," I said, the word slipping out before I could stop it. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the blood rushing to my face. "I won't." My mother's smile faltered, her face twisting with fury. "You will do as I say, girl," she snarled. "You don't have a choice." I backed away, my breath shallow. "I won't marry him. I won't live that life." For the first time, something inside me clicked, something I hadn't realized was there before. This wasn't just about avoiding an arranged marriage. It wasn't just about avoiding the life my mother had planned for me. It was about taking control. It was about finally standing up to the terror that had ruled my existence for so long. My mother raised a shaky hand, pointing at me with a look of disgust. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You always do." I turned away, my mind racing. But before I could leave the room, my father appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly, but there was something different about him that night, something I had never seen before. It was like a switch had been flipped. He stepped into the room, his voice low but resolute. "No," he said firmly, looking my mother in the eye. "She will not marry him." My mother's eyes widened in shock. For years she had controlled him with ease. She had never once been challenged by him. But now in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Strength. He wasn't just talking to her. He was talking to himself. And in that moment, he was fighting for me. "You don't have the right," my father said, his voice growing steadier. "She is my daughter. I won't let you do this to her." My mother's face twisted with rage. "You're a fool, Walter," she hissed. "You've always been a fool," but my father didn't flinch. "Not anymore. It ends now." And just like that, something changed. My father, the man who had spent his life bowed beneath my mother's will, had finally found his voice. He stood between me and her, not with fear but with defiance. And I knew in that moment that everything had shifted. My mother's glare could have burned a hole in the walls, but it didn't matter. My father had spoken, and for the first time in years, I saw him for who he really was. A man who loved me enough to fight for me, even if it meant risking everything. "You're wrong," my father said, his voice filled with quiet power. "I'm not afraid anymore, and neither is she." That night we left. The days after my father's defiance were a blur. It felt like we were living on borrowed time, as if the entire house, with all its tension and silence, was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. My mother had been furious, her anger like a storm ready to break. But for the first time in years, my father stood his ground, and I felt something in the air shift, a feeling I hadn't known in a long time. Hope. A tiny, fragile spark of it, but hope doesn't come without its price. And the price we had to pay for that defiance was the price of freedom itself. My father and I knew we couldn't stay in that house. The walls were closing in, the air thick with the promise of something terrible. My mother wasn't just angry, she was scared. Scared of losing control, losing her grip on the life she had built around fear. And there was nothing more dangerous than a person backed into a corner, especially when they've spent their whole life wielding that control like a weapon. We had to leave. We had to run. I remember the quiet conversations we had in the dead of night, in the dark corners of the house where no one could hear us. My father's voice would be low and steady, filled with resolve, but also the fear that had always been with him. He didn't say much, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was scared. He was terrified of what would happen to us if we failed. But there was something else in his eyes, too. Determination. The kind of determination that only comes when you've finally had enough. We didn't have much. My father had spent years living paycheck to paycheck, making just enough to keep the house running, to keep the roof over our heads. But now, we were starting with nothing. No savings, no plan, just a desperate desire to escape. "Do you have any money saved up?" I asked one night as I sat beside him on the old couch, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. He was sitting there, staring into the flickering flames of the dying fire, his face tight with worry. "A little," he replied, his voice steady but strained. "Not much, but enough to get us out of here." I could see the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about the cost of freedom, the price of leaving behind everything we knew, everything we had been forced to accept. "We need a plan," I said, my voice firm. "We need to get out of here, and we need to do it fast." My father nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the old map that lay on the table. He spread it out between us, his fingers tracing the roads, the routes that would take us as far away from here as possible. I could see the conflict in his eyes, his deep desire to protect me, but also his fear of what was to come. "We can't go to the city," he said. "Too many people know us there. Too many eyes. We'll head east, away from the main roads, through the forest." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I looked at the map. The forest was the only way out, the only safe way out. If we could reach the train station just outside of town, we could catch a freight train to a distant city. From there, we could start over, somewhere far from my mother, far from the life that had suffocated us for so long. But it wouldn't be easy. We were going to be fugitives, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a small bag of money. There would be no turning back. We would be hunted. My mother had friends, too many people who would do her bidding, and my Uncle Dennis was just as dangerous as she was. If he found out what we were planning, there would be no escaping him. Do you think we can do it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father didn't hesitate. We have no choice. We have to. The next few days were a blur of preparation, careful planning, secret meetings, and stolen moments when no one was looking. We packed only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, a small amount of cash, and whatever we could carry without drawing attention. My father made arrangements to sell some of his tools to get extra money for the trip, though it broke his heart to part with them. These were the tools that had earned him respect at the mill, the tools that had defined his life. But we couldn't take anything with us. We needed to move light, move fast. The night before we planned to leave, my father pulled me aside in the dim light of the kitchen. His hands were shaking slightly as he handed me a small envelope. "This is for you," he said quietly. "In case we get separated. It's a ticket to somewhere safe, a place I know I can get you to if anything goes wrong." I looked at the ticket. Just a piece of paper, but it meant everything. It was our escape route, our ticket to freedom. But as I took it in my hand, I knew that it wasn't just about the physical distance between us and the house. It was about everything we had to leave behind. The memories, the pain, the fear. The next morning we left before the sun had risen. We slipped out the back door, careful not to wake anyone, and disappeared into the woods. There was no going back. As I sit here now, looking back on everything we've been through, I'm struck by one simple truth. It's never too late to break free. No matter how long you've been trapped, no matter how many years you've spent in fear, there's always a way out. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if there's one thing I've learned in all of this, it's that even the darkest nights can give way to the dawn. My father and I didn't have much when we left that night. We had no plan, no backup, and no certainty that we'd make it. But we had each other. We had the belief that we could rebuild, that we could start fresh, and that we didn't have to live in the shadow of fear any longer. And so we did. We built a new life, a life full of quiet moments, like sitting on the porch at sunset, and small victories, like my father's first real smile after years of silence. We learned to trust again, to find joy in the simple things. And I learned, too, that my father's courage wasn't just in his actions, it was in the love he had for me, the quiet determination that kept us going through the hardest of days. But that's not the end of the story. No, that's where you come in. Because you don't have to wait for a moment like mine to take control of your life. You don't have to wait until the fear is too much to bear to start making the change. You can do it now. If you're watching this, and you're feeling trapped, if you're living in a situation where you feel like there's no way out, know this: you are stronger than you think. You have more power within you than you realize. Don't let fear define who you are. You deserve freedom. You deserve peace. And no matter how impossible it feels, there is always a way to break free. So, if my story has touched you, if you found something in it that resonates with your own journey, I ask you to take a step. Leave a comment below. Tell me about your story, your struggles, your victories. I want to hear from you, because this community is about more than just me sharing my story. It's about all of us supporting each other, lifting each other up, and reminding each other that we're never alone. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Let's continue this conversation. Let's continue building a place where strength, resilience, and hope are the stories we share. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. You never know. Your simple act of sharing might be the spark that helps someone else break free. And before I go, I want to leave you with one last thought. No matter how dark the road may seem, no matter how heavy the weight on your shoulders, remember this: freedom is always possible. You just have to find the courage to take the first step. Thank you for being here with me. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing, just like I did, that no matter where we come from, no matter what we've been through, we can always rebuild. We can always rise. The train ride felt endless, the world outside a blur of trees, empty fields, and the occasional flicker of distant lights. As we sat in the dark, the cold creeping through the cracks of the train car, I couldn't help but feel both a sense of relief and an overwhelming weight pressing down on me. We were free. But now what? Where would we go? Who could we trust? My father sat beside me, staring out at the passing landscape, his face still set with determination, but I could see the exhaustion etched in every line. He had carried so much for so long, too much, and I knew he was worn thin by the years of fear, the constant worrying. And yet, here we were, on a train headed to somewhere unknown, a chance to rebuild the life we had been denied for so long, a new beginning, but beginnings aren't easy. They never are. We arrived in a small town several hours away from the one we had fled. Jim Thorpe, it was called, a quiet, peaceful place tucked into the heart of the mountains. There was no grand welcome, no promises of safety or comfort, just a small town that had no reason to question our arrival. We didn't need anything more. We needed a place to breathe, a place to hide. We found an old, run-down cabin on the edge of town. It wasn't much, barely more than a shack, really. The walls were thin, the roof leaked in the rain, and the floors creaked underfoot. But for the first time in my life, it felt like home. For the first time, I felt like I could rest. My father worked odd jobs around town, taking whatever he could find to keep us afloat. He wasn't ashamed of the work. If anything, I admired him more for it. It wasn't the kind of life he had imagined for himself, but he made it work. His hands, once so steady and sure, were rough and scarred from years of labor, but they never stopped moving. He worked as a handyman, fixed fences, repaired roofs, whatever needed doing. His pride was never in the work itself, but in the fact that he was providing for me, that he was protecting me. Every job he took, every hour he worked was for us. I tried to help, though I didn't have much experience. I started by taking odd jobs around town, cleaning houses, running errands for the local shopkeepers. But the real work I did was inside myself. I had to learn to live without fear. I had to learn to speak my mind, to stand up for myself, to trust again. My mother had taught me to fear everything, to doubt myself, to believe I wasn't worthy of happiness, and for years I had believed her. But here, in this tiny cabin, I started to realize something. My father wasn't the only one who needed to rebuild. So did I. It wasn't easy. The first few months were the hardest. The fear still lived inside me, like a ghost that wouldn't leave. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was watching me, convinced my mother's voice would call out from the dark. But each day I fought to silence that voice. I fought to trust that we were safe now, that we weren't living in the shadow of her control anymore. Slowly, my father and I began to settle into a rhythm. He would leave for work early in the morning, and I would stay behind, cleaning the cabin, organizing our things, finding small ways to make our new life feel real. In the afternoons, we would sit together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, the sky turning orange and pink. Sometimes we didn't speak. Sometimes we just sat there, letting the quiet fill the space between us. And that too felt like progress. As the months passed, things got easier. We were no longer running, no longer hiding. We were building something real, something solid. My father became a fixture in the town. People respected him for his hard work, for his quiet strength. I too found my place. I enrolled in the local night school to finish my education. It was strange at first, sitting in a classroom again, surrounded by people who didn't know my story. But I realized slowly that I didn't need to tell them. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I was here, and that was enough. As I began to build a life for myself, I noticed something I hadn't expected. I began to forgive my father for all the years of silence, for all the moments when I had begged him to protect me, and he hadn't. I realized now that he had been fighting his own battle, one he hadn't been strong enough to win, until that night when he finally found the courage. That was when everything changed for us, when he finally stood up for me, when he finally took control of our lives. He gave me something I hadn't had in years: hope. One evening, after dinner, we sat together on the porch, just the two of us, watching the stars appear one by one in the dark sky. My father turned to me, his face softer now, the years of pain and fear slowly melting away. "Josie," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I know I wasn't always there for you. I wasn't strong enough. But I'm here now, and I will always be here." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. The man who had been broken, the man who had been afraid, was finally free, and in his freedom I found my own. "I know, Dad," I said softly. "I know, and that's enough." The night we planned to leave felt different from all the others. There was an electric charge in the air, a sense of urgency that hung heavy over the house like a storm cloud ready to burst. We didn't speak much, not even to each other, as we moved quietly around the house, gathering the last of our things and preparing for what was to come. My father was unnervingly calm, his eyes hard and focused, but I could see the small tremors in his hands as he folded up the few clothes we'd packed and placed them into the old suitcase. It was as if everything had led to this moment: the years of fear, the suffocating silence, the anger that had built up inside me. All of it was coming to a head, and tonight, we were finally going to break free. We had no illusions about what would happen if we were caught. If my mother found out, if my Uncle Dennis found out, there would be no forgiveness. They would stop us. They would tear us apart. So, the plan had to be flawless, and even then, it wasn't certain that we would make it out alive. But there was no other choice. We couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep waiting for my father to find the courage to protect me. He had done it tonight, but this was the beginning of something bigger. "Are you ready?" my father asked, his voice low as he walked into the living room, where I was standing by the door, my coat draped over my shoulders. The weight of it felt like an anchor, but it was also a symbol of the escape. We were going to leave. We were going to start over. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The same fear I had lived with my entire life. It was the fear of the unknown. The fear of what would happen once we left this place. This house that had been both a prison and a home. A place that had both shaped and broken us. It was a familiar fear, but tonight I wasn't afraid of it. I was afraid of staying. We crept out into the yard, moving silently through the grass. The night was cold, the air sharp as it cut through my thin jacket. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. We didn't have much time. The train station was a few miles away, but there was no telling how long it would take for my uncle to realize we were gone. Once he figured it out, there was no doubt in my mind that he would come after us. I glanced over at my father as we walked. His face was pale, his eyes scanning the dark woods ahead. He was scared, I could tell. But there was something else there too, a determination, a quiet resolve. He wasn't just walking for himself anymore, he was walking for me, for the life he hadn't been able to give me for so many years. The woods were dark and silent, the only sound the crunch of our footsteps on the frozen ground. As we neared the edge of the trees, I felt the weight of everything we were leaving behind. The house, my mother, the life we had known. It all felt so far away, like it belonged to someone else. A part of me wanted to look back, wanted to make sure I was really leaving, but I didn't. I couldn't. We reached the road that would take us to the station, and that's when we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, crunching through the frost. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to my father. His eyes were wide with alarm, his face tight with fear. "Someone's coming," I whispered, barely able to breathe. He held up a hand, motioning for me to be quiet. We stopped dead in our tracks, trying to blend into the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel my pulse in my ears, thudding like a drumbeat. We had to move, had to hide. But where? "Get to the woods," my father murmured, pushing me in the direction of the trees. We ducked behind a large oak tree, both of us holding our breath as the figure passed by. I strained my eyes, trying to make out who it was, but all I could see was a dark silhouette moving in the dim light. The figure stopped for a moment, then moved on. "Shh," my father said, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. We wait. Just a little longer. The footsteps grew quieter as the figure moved past us, and we slowly began to relax. But the tension didn't leave us. The danger was still there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for us to slip up. My father glanced at me, his expression grim but resolute. "We move now, keep low. We can't let them find us." We took off, running as quietly as we could, our feet barely touching the ground. Every step felt like a sprint for our lives, the cold air burning in our lungs as we pushed ourselves harder. My father kept a steady pace beside me, always watching, always listening. We ran for what felt like miles, our destination just out of reach, the station waiting for us in the distance. But every moment felt like an eternity. When we finally reached the train station, the station master was there, just as my father had promised. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't even seem surprised when we slipped past the gates and onto the platform. "There's a freight train passing through in a few minutes," the station master said, his voice low and hurried. "It's your only shot." We nodded, our breath coming in sharp gasps. There was no turning back now. The train pulled into the station, its metal wheels screeching as it slowed to a stop. The conductor barely looked up as we climbed onto the car, slipping into the shadows where no one could see us. The doors slammed shut behind us, and I could feel the vibrations of the train beneath my feet as it began to move. My heart was racing, my thoughts a blur. We were free. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. As the train rattled through the night, I turned to my father, who stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something in his face. Something that had been missing for so long. Hope. We were free. And no one could take that away from us.